Russia is going through some hard times right now. But its military won't be weak in 2025. In fact, it might even become powerful again. Here's why. In today's video, we'll look at how the Russian military will shape up in 2025. But before we do that, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an upload. Also, don't forget to check out our other content. Thanks. Now back to the topic at hand. How strong will Russia be militarily in 3 years? We know that Russia has been suffering heavy losses in Ukraine, especially in terms of military hardware. But the situation could change drastically by 2025. Russia's invasion of Ukraine began in February 2022, with an initial plan to quickly take over Kyiv and topple the government. However, this plan failed due to strong Ukrainian resistance. As a result, Putin had to adjust his goals. The war then became about taking control of the Donbass region and securing a land bridge to Crimea. Even though this adjusted goal seemed attainable, it also proved difficult to achieve. Despite these setbacks, the Kremlin still considers the war in Ukraine a success. This is because the Russian military has managed to exhaust the West's willingness to support Ukraine. The US and Europe have provided billions of dollars in military aid to Ukraine since the invasion. But this aid has not been enough to turn the tide of the war in Ukraine's favor. Furthermore, there are signs that the West's resolve to help Ukraine is starting to wane. For example, Germany has been hesitant to send Ukraine offensive weapons. Some US politicians have questioned the amount of aid the US has given to Ukraine. This weakening resolve by the West is good news for Russia, because it means that Ukraine will be less able to resist a renewed Russian offensive in the future. Of course, this does not mean that Ukraine will simply collapse. Rather, it means that Ukraine will be more open to negotiations with Russia, and whatever terms Russia is able to negotiate is likely to be favorable to them. But what does all this have to do with the strength of the Russian military in 2025? Will you see? The reason why the Russian military has been so successful in Ukraine is because they have access to cutting-edge technology. Even though much of this equipment is old and outdated, they still have advanced capabilities that the Ukrainian military simply cannot match. For example, Russia has superior air power, cyber warfare capabilities, and nuclear weapons. Additionally, Russia has a much larger population to draw from for military service. This means that even though Russia has suffered heavy losses in Ukraine, they are still able to keep fighting. They may be losing battles, but as long as they exhaust the West's willingness to support Ukraine, they are still winning the war. So when we look ahead to 2025, we can see that Russia will still be a major military threat. In fact, things could get even worse for Ukraine, because Russia could very well decide to ramp up their offensive in the next few years. This would be bad news for Ukraine, because even though they have received military aid from the West, it simply is not enough to defeat the Russian military. Instead, the only way for Ukraine to win the war would be if they could somehow persuade the West to get directly involved. However, this is highly unlikely to happen. The United States and its allies have made it clear that they have no intention of getting into a direct conflict with Russia. This is because the stakes are simply too high. A conflict between NATO and Russia would very likely escalate into a nuclear war, which would be devastating for everyone involved. So let's say that Ukraine is not able to persuade the West to get involved. Then the only other option would be for them to try to negotiate a peace deal with Russia. However, this is also unlikely to happen anytime soon because neither side is willing to make concessions. Ukraine wants all of their territory back, while Russia wants to keep the territory they have already taken. So it seems that the only way for Ukraine to win the war would be if they could somehow force Russia to the negotiating table. They could do this by inflicting heavy casualties on the Russian military. But as we said earlier, the Russian military is just too powerful for Ukraine to do this. As you can see, things are looking bleak for Ukraine. The only way they can win the war is by inflicting heavy casualties on the Russian military, or by persuading the West to get involved. But both of these options are unlikely to happen. However, things could get even worse for Ukraine in 2025, because Russia could decide to ramp up its offensive. As we said earlier, the Russian military is still a powerful force to be reckoned with. Even though they have suffered heavy losses in Ukraine, they still have access to cutting-edge technology that the Ukrainian military simply cannot match. Additionally, Russia has a much larger population to draw from for military service. This means that even though Russia has suffered heavy losses in Ukraine, they are still able to keep fighting. If Russia ramps up its offensive in 2025, it could spell disaster for Ukraine. The Ukrainian military is already struggling to defend their country, they simply don't have the resources to fight off a full-scale Russian offensive. There are a few reasons why Russia might ramp up its offensive in 2025. First of all, Russia knows that the West's resolve to support Ukraine is starting to wane. This means that Ukraine will be less able to resist a renewed Russian offensive. Additionally, Russia might feel that they need to make a breakthrough in the war before the West ramps up its production of weapons for Ukraine. Finally, Russia might just feel that they need to finish the job in Ukraine. They've already invested too much time, money, and resources into the war to simply walk away from it now. Whatever the reason, if Russia decides to ramp up its offensive in 2025, it could be bad news for Ukraine. But what about Russia itself? How will the country be affected by the war in 2025? By then, the war will have been going on for 3 years, so will have a significant impact on the Russian economy. The war is already costing Russia billions of dollars every day, and by 2025, the costs will continue to mount. Additionally, sanctions from the West are making it difficult for Russia to get the supplies it needs to keep fighting. It is possible that by 2025, the Russian economy will be so strained by the war that Putin will feel pressure to end the conflict. This could lead to Russia pulling out of Ukraine or making significant concessions to Ukraine. But even if Russia ends the war in Ukraine in 2025, it will still be a weakened country. The war has already taken a toll on the Russian economy, and the sanctions from the West will continue to make things difficult for Russia. Additionally, Russia will have lost prestige on the world stage. The war has shown that the Russian military is not as invincible as it once was. Additionally, Russia has been isolated diplomatically. Most of the countries in the world have condemned Russia's actions in Ukraine and refused to do business with them. So even if Russia is still a major military power in 2025, it will be a shadow of its former self. In conclusion, the Russian military will still be a powerful force in 2025, but it will be far from invincible. If Russia continues to fight against Ukraine, it will eventually have to face the consequences. The war will take a heavy toll on the Russian economy, and eventually the Russian people will start to suffer. At that point, it is possible that Putin will be forced to end the war either by pulling out of Ukraine or by making significant concessions to Ukraine. What do you think? Will Russia still be a major military power in 2025? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.